I just want to welcome everyone to our first event of the year, a webinar for the Center for the Study of Europe. My name is Kaya Schilde. I'm a professor at the Pardee School of Global Studies, and I'm the acting director of the Center for the Study of Europe this year. And so, of course, for our first event, I wanted to choose a dear friend and colleague and co-author to selfishly know what her book manuscript is about that she's been working on for the last few years. And so I'm excited today to welcome Rosella Capella-Zielinski, who is as of this summer, an associate professor of political science at Boston University, and also a frequent colleague and co-author and collaborator with me on a lot of things. And so you'll see in this conversation that I'll be moderating, and am very fond and very curious about Rosella's research and interest in all of her work. I think it's fabulous. And so today she's going to be presenting a book manuscript that is ongoing with Professor Paul Post of University of Chicago. And the title is Feeding Allies, Wheat and Inter-Allied Institutions During the Great War. And I'm fascinated in what she's going to be talking about because it's going to be historically interesting, but it's also a very novel argument about how the international institutions that we know today came about and the origins of those. So Rosella, please.
Thanks, Kaya. Thanks for everyone who's here today. So I'm going to share my screen right quick and we can get started. Thank you all for having me here, especially for your first event. Obviously, I wish we could all be meeting in person, but given that I'm splitting my time between Texas and Oklahoma, that would actually make my life difficult, even though I'm down the road in political science. So as Kaya mentioned, this has been my ongoing book project with Paul Post. We are about ready to put it under review. So if anyone has any comments, concerns, we can still get those in before this is under review in the next week or two. So I'll jump in and I'm going to speak a little French and Italian, and I apologize in advance as I am sure I'm going to butcher everything, but I do not mean to do so. So a poster with an enormous crusty loaf of bread in front of a silhouette of a warship is probably not how anyone is thinking about Britain and its war effort during World War I. Yet in 1917, this was a prominent wartime poster with the words "Save the wheat and help the fleet, eat less bread." In France in 1918, a group of school children designed a poster not with a French soldier, but with a sickle, a chaff of wheat, and the French flag, reading "Semer du blé, c'est l'or pour la France," translated into "Grow wheat, it is good for France." And while the United States doesn't have the same wheat problem as Britain and France, it definitely contributed its concern for wheat, as you can see in this war poster. Will you help the women of France save wheat? And finally, this is actually, from my understanding, an American war poster in Italian. I practice saying it. I am part Italian. I should be able to do it well, but I'm going to forego that right now. But it translates into, Italy has need of meat, wheat, fat, and sugar. Eat little of this food because it must go to our people, to the troops of Italy. So what's interesting and what really this project for us is how food shortages are elevated during the middle of the war to be the greatest danger. And indeed, in a joint press statement of the prime ministers of France, Great Britain, and Italy, they actually say it's the deliberate conviction that food shortage, with its effect on the morale of the population, which has been one of the principal causes of the breakdown of Russia, is the greatest danger at present threatening each of the European allies. And it was such a great danger that they forewent shipping on munitions to make sure they had tonnage for wheat. In another press statement, they write, the prime ministers, apologies, I'm reading, of France, Great Britain and Italy declared to Herbert Hoover, who was helping orchestrate tonnage at this time, that a shipment of 1 million tons in February and March of 1918 was minimum because the need for bread cereals in Europe cannot be exaggerated. The shipping required to provide more wheat than was achieved, but had only been possible by reduction of the importation of munitions, to such an extent as would not have been contemplated, but for the critical character of the food situation. So we're actually saying, no, we don't need munitions in a high consumption munition war. We need cereals, we need bread, we need wheat. And so that raises some questions for us. How did the Allies come to jointly understand that food was the greatest danger? Indeed, you saw a war poster from the US about conserving wheat, and the US was a net wheat exporter. So they jointly came to understand that food was the greatest danger. How did they work together to address this danger? Under what conditions did they create institutions to address these problems, and what form of institutional design facilitated their success? And how do we understand the legacies of these institutions? And so Paul and I, for better or worse, took on the task of answering all four of these empirical questions. And so we want to take a step back. Why wheat and why World War I? Unfortunately, I think political scientists, again, coming from political science on this slide here, we really don't think about agriculture very much. And there's been a lot of historiography on World War I. So why did we take on this? Well, one, it's an interesting case because it affects all the people of Europe, right? Wheat is a cornerstone of societal stability, and it's eaten by all classes. And because it's such a cornerstone, the leaders of Europe really care, right? Because it's tied to economic and political stability. Increase in wheat prices really was damaging, leading to all sorts of strikes throughout Europe. For the war effort, as we saw earlier, right? They're just saying, no, we don't want munitions, we need wheat, right? It affects the war effort. And if we care about institutions and institution building during the war, it precedes coordination on other foodstuff, raw materials, and war inputs. And so it allows us to explore how these bureaucrats learned and applied lessons of wheat to other areas. And it has these really important legacies of immediate post-war coordination. Indeed, the wheat executive continues after the war and is part of the Supreme Economic Council. And the same folks who are part of coordinating wheat end up leading the League of Nations. All of the things I'm going to talk about today pretty much get immediately resurrected in the beginning of World War II. And the lessons carry on through various bureaucrats, including Jean Monnet, into the European coal and steel community. So this little nugget of wheat in World War I is, not to use a rot metaphor, a seed that blossoms that affects all sorts of things later down the line. And as a conflict scholar, we're concerned with how do allies organize their economies in a great war. That's been covered a lot militarily, but not economically. And so we know militarily, allies can organize to be greater than the sum of their parts, but how can they do that economically? So this is just an incredibly robust case that we'd like to mine for all sorts of things. So let's talk about coordinating allied supply for war. And so there's going to be these tensions that are going to bubble up throughout this presentation. How to balance supplying an ally while meeting the needs of your own military, right? You want the coalition to do well, but you also want to do well. How do you prevent an increase in prices to keep the cost of war low and support the civilian economy? So we're at war, and this is a big war, but you still need to keep your people happy and fed. And how do you coordinate goods amongst allies who are all going to be placing their own respective needs first? So this is just a story fraught with tension. As Kaya once said to me, no one likes a happy family. So this is that case of not a happy family, but still a family. So if you're not familiar with wartime supply problems, I'll just give you a little breakdown. Purchasing of goods for war can affect prices and consumption at home. I know we have lived through 2 decades of war in the United States, but in these large, intense wars, it's not so easy where you can just continue business as usual at home, right? The government becomes a major buyer in the war effort, taking increasing demand for goods. And often during these big wars, you have reduced supply due to, destruction of territory, destruction of trade routes. So prices go up, and that's not great for the civilian economy, nor for the cost of the war effort. And you have to get things from one location to another. And We don't have today, and we didn't then, various countries, the transportation networks to be able to do this easily, right? So you have to take civilian transportation and use it for the war effort. And that can also push up prices. We all know in an age of COVID that supply shocks are real and things are stuck at ports. That's the same as what's going on here. And all of these problems that any one country alone, everyone in the coalition is experiencing. So I'll have a couple political sciencey theory slides, but I promise I will go through them quickly. So for those political scientists not in the room, don't worry, we're going to get to a Europe story in a minute. But how do we think about allied coordination problems? So Paul and I think about it in two ways: where are the resources for the war located, inside or outside the coalition? And are they abundant or are they scarce? And in a great scenario, tons of resources located inside your coalition, you don't need to coordinate anything. Go ahead, buy what you need. But it's going to start getting more complicated. What if there are a lot of resources and they're outside your coalition? You're going to want to coordinate with your coalition members. You're going to want to say, hey, let's act together and keep the costs of war down. And if we purchase as a monopsony, act as a single buyer, then we can control the prices. But to do that, you need to share information. So I need to say, hey, these are my wheat needs. What are yours? What are your tonnage needs? How are you going to ship this from here to there? You need to coordinate all that. And importantly, you need to make sure you act as a single buyer, meaning no one ally is going to cheat and just buy on their own on the side. So that's a pure coordination problem of just putting your needs on the table, sharing your preferences. But the problem is, allies, remember that tension, they care about their own needs, and they're not very likely to go on board with this plan. But that's not the worst case scenario if they decided to fact. So we can expect not very robust institutions, maybe a little bit of sharing of information, but that's about all. Okay, what about if they start getting scarce, but the resources are inside the coalition? Good news, they're there. But if those resources are scarce, especially if they're in the hands of one state, one coalition member in question, you're going to start seeing some tension there, because that state's going to control or could leverage the distribution and prices of that good. So you're going to want to have coordination, because remember, goods are scarce, and we all, as members of this coalition, want to do well in the war. But that coordination could reflect that dominant state power, the one with the supplying goods. And my favorite scenario here, what if resources are scarce and they're found outside the coalition? Whew, this is not good. You do not want to be bidding past each other if you're allies in this scenario. You want to make sure that you are acting as a single buyer. And to do that, you want to develop robust institutions, have dedicated bureaucrats where this is all they do. Otherwise, you're never going to get the supplies you need, and you're never going to get them at a price. So we should expect to see really robust institutions. All right, I just presented you a pretty simple world where problems equal solutions, but we know the world does not work that way. And bureaucrats need to learn how to solve a problem, how to understand a problem, how to solve it. And World War I is a great long war, not great, bad, but great for studying, because you have various war pressures, crop failures, shipping problems. And all of these things come together to create a cadre of dedicated bureaucrats from each of the various countries involved, who start to take on the identity of the collective and not of the individual countries, to go through an experience of trial, error, and learning that result in very strong institutions. Then one we're going to focus on today is the wheat executive. And this becomes the model. Okay, so let's jump into the story. We're going to look for today only at two periods. This is monthly spot wheat prices in 5 key US markets, and we'll talk about it in a minute. The United States is one of the primary sources of wheat for the Allies. And we're going to look at these two big jumps in wheat prices. So we're going to look at the period of 1915 and again that 1916 to 17 period. And we're going to understand, how did the Allies react to, in political science speak, are these going to be critical junctures? So let's give you some background. Before World War I, the Allies do pretty well for themselves on wheat. France grows a lot of their own. The rest is supplemented from Russia. Italy grows a lot of their own. The rest is supplemented from Russia. And Britain, unfortunately, is a net food importer. There are some great numbers. About 4 of every 5 loaves of bread in Britain before the war are imported. And again, they're getting most of their wheat from Russia. The war starts, Russia is knocked out, but wheat's not that big of a problem. And by the way, Russia's knocked out. The closing of the Dardanelles mean Russian wheat can't be exported into Europe, but that's not so bad. Wheat's still mostly available, but that should have read outside. Apologies, the coalition. We can get a lot of wheat from India and Australia, but they're pretty far. So the European allies are going to turn to the United States, Argentina, and a little bit Brazil. And I have Canada in there. And while Canada is part of the Crown allows for the Winnipeg wheat market to set its own prices. So Canada has robust wheat, but it is setting prices, not Britain. So it's a little bit of it in the middle. So things aren't so bad. Wheat's abundant outside the coalition. And the winter wheat crops of 1914 and the early wheat crops of 1915 are bountiful. But, oh, apologize, I went too fast. But the war starts, we get the closing of Russian wheat, and then France, and that's just a contemporary picture of pockmarked France. All of the northern crop wheat areas are just gonna get taken out through trench warfare, and they're not gonna be able to come back. Subsoil is turned up from bombing. We have trenches, and I have a great quote, if I can find it in my notes here, regarding it. Here we go. The war quickly destroyed an unusual 700 kilometers of front lines. French artillerymen described the destroyed landscape as covered with innumerable scars, swollen by artificial mounds and heaps, giving one the curious impression of being used up of abstract. So all of this is wasteland now, unfortunately. That, coupled with the closing of Russia, the closing of the Dardanelles, means we have to go far for the allies for wheat. And the allies need to coordinate. Remember, there's wheat, it's just a little far away. And they're like, okay, well, we have it, we can each go at it alone, but is that the best way to do it? We get Etienne Clementel, he's the Minister of Commerce for France. He comes in 1915 with the new Brienne government. He hires Jean Monnet to work for him. And Etienne Clementel is an interesting character. No one in France is really paying attention to the Ministry of Commerce, so he just kind of gets free rein to do what he wants to do. And he brings in a bunch of non-government bureaucrats. So they're really seeing an opening here about how France is going to approach this situation. Jean Monnet describes him as one of those men who, knowing their abilities, find their vocation in politics and are so capable that no one knows if this is the reason for their staying in power or the result of it. So he's clearly he has a lot of mystique and business acumen, let's just put it that way. And he believes tighter cooperation is necessary amongst the allies. So he's very invested in economic cooperation. And Etienne Clementel, even in 1915, sees the writing on the wall. He cares about post-war Europe economic relations, and he's going to use this to cement a strong Entente economic relationship after the war. That's his goal. It's not the immediate. He always has one eye to the post-war economic environment and seeing a future for Allied economic relations to really tamper down German economy, relatively tamper down. Okay, so he is leading the crusade with Jean Monnet pushing him. And then we get Walter Runciman, who is the British Board of Trade. And so between them, what happens at the end of 19 is they come to a deal. The French, British, Italian governments believe that cooperation would be better than competing against each other for this wheat market. And what they form is the Joint Committee. This joint committee had representatives from the 3 governments meeting daily in London to make purchases of wheat, flour, and maize as a prerequisite. And let me just say one more thing. I'll go back for a second about the joint committee. It does well. they make secret purchases throughout the winter because they don't want to disrupt the markets. So they make purchases in secret. I wanted to clarify that. Kathleen Burke, an amazing historian, has written a lot about this, this period and these secret purchases. And it's just not enough, though. The British are a little bit skittish. They don't want to keep making secret purchases to disrupt because they're afraid they'll find out and the market will be disrupted, and the French want more. So Etienne Clemenceau puts together a conference of ministers, the Paris Conference, in which he pushes for more allied economic cooperation that's going to affect post-war relations. So we have a semi-weak institution in the Joint Committee and big ideas coming out of the Paris Conference, but nothing more than big ideas, a talk shop, so to speak. Okay, things are okay for now, but they're not going to be okay in a minute, because in the fall of 1916, we get some serious supply shocks. First, we get a bunch of crop failures. The bumper crop of 1915 is short-lived. And in 1916, poor weather conditions yield the 1916 wheat crop globally, like it's destroyed. So we have some problems. Let me pull up my notes here. By the fall of 1916, the South American wheat crop is in ruin. In Argentina, for instance, the crop was 40% below expectations due to drought and locusts, and prices for Argentine wheat rose 70%. This is just not going to work out. Then there's a lot of hope, and indeed one of the reasons for the Gallipoli campaign was to open up the Dardanelles to Russian wheat. The campaign fails, and everyone's evacuated. That closes off Russian wheat for the rest of the war. The Italians join the war effort en masse. They have their wheat needs, and now we have U-boat attacks. So we're getting increased demand, decreased supply, and decreased in difficulties of getting that supply to continental Europe. This is a problem, and everyone knows it. The press and the public are agitating, and I'm not going to read it, but we have these quotes by Churchill doing this whole big thing like, hey, Walter Rinseman, why didn't you do more? So it's a politically salient issue about how high wheat prices are. And while I'm not going to talk about it here, I should note each government is doing their best internally to reduce demand. So if you want baking recipes that don't include wheat, 1916 has a ton of recipe books available. Okay, so we need more. We need more robust institutions because supply is scarce and outside the coalition. We get Etienne Clemenceau back at it, with Jean Monnet pushing the situation, Walter Rinseman, and now a businessman who's going to become central to the wheat executive, J. Arthur Salter. These folks come together and push for a stronger institution. And even Monnet writes, 2 years after the outbreak of war, the question of Allied transport pool could still not be tackled head on. It's too big of a problem. It threatened to raise questions of sovereignty that no one was ready to answer. Salter and I thought the first test case for Allied cooperation should be wheat, where there had been very unsatisfactory attempts at joint organization, the Joint Committee already mentioned. For a whole year, this divided purchasing system had been operating in a spirit of competition that encouraged international speculation. To put an end of this speculation had become vital. To use the opportunity to try out a new method of cooperation had become possible. I persuaded Clemenceau with so good an opportunity, he should play for high stakes. The British wanted results. We wanted a lasting organization. And so after many conferences and organizations, Clemenceau going to Britain in person, all of that, we are going to start getting the pooling of wheat and shipping. We get negotiations, the challenges facing the Allies, and long story short, the wheat executive agreement is signed on 29 November. The wheat executive is kind of everything that they wanted it to be. It is, well, let me just say the agreement's only 1 page long. And it called for the powers to work together to A, control the various cereals, which they may decide to schedule as necessity arises. B, purchase in other countries and import to their own countries the cereal scheduled. Wheat is scheduled and will herein be controlled by the scheme of this agreement. So as in the wheat executive is going to purchase for everybody and decide who gets what. And critically, according to Article 2 of the agreement, the wheat executive shall have full powers to meet the requirements of the allies by the purchase and allocation of scheduled cereals and to arrange transport. In other words, this body and the representatives of this body, which end up being Jean Monnet, Jean Beal, another John, lots of Johns, John Anderson, and Salter, and then other representatives that will come in, are making the final decisions for the allies of who gets what. It's centered in London. I'll talk about those other countries who join in a minute. And everyone is providing full information: wheat production, wheat needs, what they've purchased, their tonnage availability, and their tonnage needs. Worldwide supply and international distribution and unity of control from the production market to the final destination. My husband uses the metaphor all the time of soup to nuts. Nuts not my favorite, but it's basically soup to nuts. It's the whole thing. And in the end, this organization purchases for everybody. They purchase for Belgium, Sweden, Switzerland, Norway. Yes, they're purchasing for neutrals. Greece, Portugal, Spain, Holland, Iceland, Madeira. And they go way beyond wheat. They're purchasing North American wheat and flour, Indian wheat, Japanese flour, and you can read it there. So this is a huge, robust organization with lots of sovereignty, lots of control, pooling wheat and tonnage to act as one. This was just an image of the minutes. I got all of the wheat minutes from the Hoover Institution at Stanford. I didn't talk about all the archives we scoured, but the minutes were all from the Hoover Institution at Stanford. And you can just see how much information each country is providing. And this is a roaring success. By 1918, the wheat executive had control over the buying of 415 out of 538 million, 77% of bushels of total exports from the 6 chief exporting countries. And I found this line and I love it. As noted by an economist, by the end of the war, the executive decided for practically all of the open countries of Europe how much to buy, where to buy it, how to transport, and where to send it. It's incredibly, I'm sorry, I was just re-editing this chapter. I just am blown away by how powerful this institution was and how successful. And I won't get into it, but what we do after our tracing of the wheat executive is look at the next institution that arises from it, the Allied Maritime Transport Council. Shipping is a big problem. And while the U-boat attacks, there are various defense convoys and ways out of that problem, but for 1917, it was a big problem. And they decided we need to pool all of shipping for everything beyond wheat. And the wheat executive even said, we are just going to look at wheat, because there was conversation of how much could the wheat executive do. And they said, nope, we're keeping our balance to wheat. We're doing well here. And what's created by these same individuals is the Allied Maritime Transport Council. So I pulled all of the AMTC minutes from NARA, and I just want to show you in this quote the power of the model of the wheat executive. Because when these problems in shipping arose, they went, yep, the wheat executive works. Let's do that. The purpose of the Allied Maritime Transport Council is to watch over the general conduct of Allied transport, to secure the necessary exchange of information and coordination and policy and effort of the governments of France, Italy, the United States, Great Britain, in adjusting the programs of imports to the carrying capacity of the available tonnage, and making the most advantageous allocation and disposition of the tonnage under the control in accordance with the urgency of war needs. In other words, let's get it to those states that need it most. Great. How are you going to do that? Well, for this purpose, the council will obtain through its permanent staff the program of import requirements drawn up by the inter-allied executives, which are established or to be established on the model of the wheat executive for each of the main classes of essential imports. So there was a lot of getting to the wheat executive, but once we do, and the allies get there, it's the model. And indeed, the wheat executive is the model for a variety of raw materials, not just shipping. We see this with Colonel House, President Wilson's primary advisor. Bodies of the main requirements for food, munitions, raw materials will be formed on the model of the wheat executive. And this carries into World War II, and I won't talk about the legacies. I'm happy to in Q&A. This is a letter from Soviet Ambassador William Bullitt to FDR. And he writes, as you may remember, Jean Monnet, who during the last war set up the Inter-Allied Purchasing Agency and the Inter-Allied Shipping Pool. I express my opinion that while Monnet would do excellently in Washington, he would be much more useful if he were relieved from the polite duties of ambassador and charged with nothing but the serious business of supply. And indeed, they do it. 1939, you get the Anglo-French Purchasing Agency, basically the wheat executive resurrected once again. And so in conclusion, and I guess I should have added a slide on the SEC and beyond in the League of Nations, but as I said earlier, the wheat executive continues. It's actually the last organization under the Supreme Economic Council to be disbanded before the League of Nations is ready to take over. So in conclusion, the goal of our project is to broaden our understanding of economic mobilization for war, to understand coalition warfare, to understand supply, and how formal organization of allies supply results in more efficient distribution of resources and lower prices. And more broadly, we want to contribute to the rich World War I historiography on coalition warfare. We are humble enough to know, and I know I'm in an audience of Europeanists, to know that there's a lot of stories about Jean Monnet. So we are here humbly today with that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rosella. That was fantastic. I knew a little bit of the project. I've heard bits and pieces of it, and I found it fascinating, but I so enjoyed the presentation of hearing it all laid out like this. So I'm going to do two things right now. I'm going to ask you a couple questions just to start off. And I also want to give the audience members to let them know that we welcome their questions, which I didn't mention at the beginning when I started my remarks and introduced you. And to start off, I have kind of a political science question, and then I have, or political economy question, actually more specifically, and then I have just a big exploratory, dangerous counterfactual question to ask you about.
Oh, bring it! We've had many a counterfactual conversation. Go for it.
Yes. And so, we could keep going in that direction if you want, but I'm just so curious. It's the kind of thing that you probably don't put down in the book. It's a little illegal to speculate on academically, but I encourage you to speculate, speculate away, in this conversation. So the political economy question is, I like your framework, but how generalizable is wheat? Or where does wheat fit in the range of commodities or things that might matter for national security, right? There could be, an agricultural product like wheat, which is, critical for basic needs of a population, but it's also quite divisible, from a political economy point of view. Like it's somewhat easy to distribute around, to store, things like that. And then there are products like, say, COVID vaccines, that are also critical to national security, that might also have a similar, logic of needing to coordinate on supply, but might have different economic factors, affecting it, or things like nuclear energy, or other kinds of resources that are less divisible, maybe, like it's hard to distribute them around as much, or requires more infrastructure. Yeah. Okay. And so then the second question I have, as a political scientist, do you think that the butterfly flapping its wings on what we know to be the 20th century, especially the later 20th century, of international institutions, of things like the European Union forming, of things like states giving up some of their sovereignty to cooperate on difficult international policy problems, do you think that would have happened had it not been for their experiences trying to make this happen in World War I?
Okay, so let me take the latter first. It's a question we've gotten before, and we had that as, in some ways, a broader argument of how, take away the wheat executive, how do we think about European, particularly international cooperation? So if you take Jean Monnet and Etienne Clementel memoirs at their word, then I would say yes. That's what they believe. They believe that these notions and ideas, because we de-elevated this. So there are international institutions that exist prior to World War I, but they're not as robust as what comes out of this and layered in terms of institutional cooperation. So if we take these manuscripts at their word, then it seems like the notion of that collectivity and that it can be done, this is the seed. But I'm also would not be bold enough to say absolutely at all in any way. And I'm not a Europeanist, so that's not, that scares me to say like, yes, this is absolutely the way it is. I don't know, but I definitely think the absolute critical juncture that is World War I really sets us on a new path that wouldn't have been there before in terms of institutional design and thinking about what institutional design is possible. And then I would say that in terms of generalizability, I actually was surprised to see how much the institutional design that was around the Weed Executive was replicated all around. But in terms of, I actually don't know why we don't pool and purchase more often as states. So to your question regarding to COVID and vaccines early on, why wasn't there collective purchasing of vaccines across various countries? I have no idea. I actually, with a bunch of historians, Mark Harrison and Mark Wilson, actually did a roundtable for Bloomberg on this, where we're like, the more you purchase and act as a monopsony, the better deals you get. So I don't understand. I understand in terms of sovereignty, but we would be advantageous to do so if more governments worked in collective to act as a buyer. We would get things a lot cheaper.
So I have another question, kind of a historiography question. It relates to something I was discussing in my European security class at seminar last week. Usually in the first few weeks of any kind of European integration class, talking about the EU, in this case, talking about the EU and security, which is often a really new topic for a lot of people because people are familiar with NATO, but not as familiar with EU security cooperation or institutions. It's difficult for people in the year 2021 to wrap their mind around the idea that European states would give up sovereignty in any area for some kind of collective good, right? But one of my jobs as a professor is to show people just how much that's already been done, how in so many ways, which are bureaucratic or maybe not visible on a day-to-day basis to publics, something just like this Weed Executive, but that is the reality of European integration is so many policies being coordinated like this at the supranational level. And so inevitably this conversation usually comes around to national identity and nationalism, as in, this couldn't possibly happen because of the core, ancient national identities of European states. And then that's where I usually say, well, maybe a couple of them, but then a lot of European national projects are less than a century old. And so that made me realize what in the contemporary discussions from these people at the time, so France and the UK were nation states, that had existed for a while by the beginning of the 20th century, but not all of their states were. Italy was a newer nation state. Was there any reference in any of this to nationalism, or or was it just sovereignty from just a pure state and power perspective?
That's a great question. I didn't see anything where the conversation was like, no, we don't want to participate. Let me put some more nuance at that. Let me reframe. At various points, there was hesitation from the Brits for increased cooperation without the Americans on board. So where I saw hesitations wasn't about, a national sovereignty perspective, but it was making sure that the Americans were on board for what they were going to contribute to the war effort when they enter the war. So in the early rounds of the Joint Committee and the Paris Conference, that really wasn't the concern. What was the concern later on, though, was if we go through with tighter economic cooperation, if the Americans don't support us, then we don't want to continue. And then actually that American support really becomes important when we get to the Supreme Economic Council. Because I remember these institutions continue after the war because wheat and shipping as a problem didn't go away. So there was a need to continue. And then you had to incorporate the rehabilitation of the Central Powers, who had their own wheat needs and their own supply needs for post-war reconstruction. And so wheat executive continues on, and eventually the United States says, yep, we're good. We don't want to do this anymore. We can do this in a free market world now. And we have growers at home that want to sell at a higher price. So we're done here. And the Britons continue on for a little bit longer, and then they bow out. So it's a slow ending towards this. And eventually the League is going to take over anyway. So they continue for a couple more months. So really any hesitation I saw is coming from a US perspective. But I think if I were to take this conversation forward, as everyone speculates, as the pivot to Asia, war with China, some kind of conflict with China, disruption of markets that would inevitably come from that, then I think we would have to think about, what do we do? And that is a big, scary, weird question that I don't have an answer to. But I would want to say that's when we could think about, well, what worked, what didn't work during this period, and how can we fast forward it to generalizability to the contemporary conflict. So in other work, I'm turning towards Indo-PACOM and the Pacific, and and what that would look like. But I think these questions are going to become way more important should some kind of conflict break out there.
And so my next question is these are not very Europe-centric questions, but this is such a fascinating cross-cutting project. It is an explanation for European integration in the 20th century. It's also a question about not just behavior of allies during war, but kind of big picture questions about sovereignty and about economics and sovereignty. And as you know, a big debate, at least in international relations and around issues to do with trade and interdependence, is about whether or not this trade leads to cooperation or can lead to vulnerability, right? And so I guess I have a two-part question about that. One is, was there any evidence that this led to vulnerability for allies at that time? Did anyone weaponize this, or was everyone on their best behavior because of kind of the criticality of the war effort? And my second part of that question is, how much do you think this translates into globalization and interdependence today? Like, if states started to try to, if they created a more robust COVAX or something like that, a global effort to the vaccine, do you think that it'd be analogous or not? Or do you think that the world has become so warped in terms of hierarchy or U.S. power, or the ways that interdependence can be exploited, if that makes sense? So are we in a different moment?
Question. So I didn't talk about, again, shipping that upper, I don't know if you remember that 2x2, but when we think about power asymmetries, where it's resources found inside the coalition, but is scarce, we kind of have this weird moment with shipping with the United States when the US enters the war. And the only time, and the US enters the war, and it's like, it sets up, oh my God, the Allied purchasing, I don't want to say company, it's like an allied purchasing something, where it says, basically, if you're going to buy in the United States anything, you need to act Europeans as one, because we're getting orders all around and this isn't working. You're hurting yourself, and we're going to put our needs first. So if we're going to coordinate, you have to come in as a single buyer, basically, and coordinate amongst yourself before you allow to purchase in the United States. So the United States pulls that card. And then with shipping, it requisitions, so US has no shipping capacity, and it requisitions boats from everywhere. There's even an instance where it requisitions ships that were being built for Britain and says, yeah, these are ours now. So it has its moment with shipping and purchases for the United States. But, and I have read in my other book where I looked at US war finance during World War II, the US really does some good hardcore quid pro quo. for other things, but I actually really didn't see it in this time. I'm surprised. Normally I'm like, oh man, the US, we suck. I think Paul wrote a piece on it. Asshole diplomacy is what he called it, I think. And the United States often does that in these situations, but I didn't really see it this time. And even though it requisitioned Allied ships, which again, I found a little mind blowing, it agreed to pool shipping with the Allied Maritime Council. So it kind of redeems itself a little bit, so to speak, if we think about what is good from the perspective of the collective. But yeah, this was not a story. I think it was a collective desperation. You have strikes in Italy, you have strikes in France, you have strikes in Britain over wheat. So it really isn't, everyone's in agreement and they see what happened to Russia and they don't want to go there. And they're in agreement, like we need to act together. So, another, the quote I use for Monet is they're like, oh, let's experiment here. But maybe there are some other reasons why wheat was the place that you could push the sovereignty issue first and not later. Yeah, and today so another question we've gotten is, why wasn't there this type of cooperation amongst the Central Powers? I thought that's where you were also going to go with your counterfactual. And part of it is there are some reasons that maybe we think about democracies and transparency that we could answer, but I just think it's because they didn't seem to like cooperating with each other. Everything I've read about Germany and Austria-Hungary at that time was not one of despite shared language and other things, was just not one of cooperation. And they didn't have the same problems regarding wheat, and they had interior supply lines, and they were not importing, right? These are like from everywhere else. So there was not the need to have this same thing. So, but yes, to generalizable today, I don't know, but I think if I'm a policymaker, I would be looking into this for the Pacific. I really would. This is not something we want to be caught unprepared for.
And it's a double move. It's not just cooperation, it's a return to industrial policy, domestically and internationally, because industrial policy is so decayed in the 21st century. States just don't think of themselves as buyers other than in defense,
Right.
for the most part. Okay, so Florian has a question in the text. Do you see it? It's that what explains the decision to supply wheat to neutral states? Is it simply, to prevent competition? Is it more, anticipating that? Is it kind of like an early, development aid kind of policy to win hearts and minds, is my addition to his question. So
I'm going to blow your mind. And I was re-editing our text for the millionth time this morning, and it even bought once for Austria. Okay. So I think it was just that powerful of an organization in terms of its ability to corner the market. Yeah. And so I think because it was just that powerful, it was able to, I remember Norway was kind of like, I don't know, I don't want to buy with you. Can we do something else? And the wheat executive was like, no. So I think it was just that successful and that powerful once they did that. So yeah, so I just found that nugget when I was reading, talking to Paul, I'm like, how did we miss this that they bought for Austria? So we're thinking about how to elevate that in the text a little bit ourselves. So I'm glad you asked, Florian, because it reminded me to put that on my to-do list. Yes, during the war, during the war, not when it was under the SEC.
Were they using an economic logic, like that it was about the size of the market size was the most important or something like that? Because if that's the case, that means that economic logic trumped security logic.
Ooh. That's a great question. I don't know. I don't remember it in the minutes of it coming out like that. I think it was really just coming from the place that we have to act as one and we need to coordinate. Full stop. It did have, since it's just since folks are just listening and Kaya's into the economic side of it all, it did have purchasing agents set up, companies that it used to purchase through. And so we don't really trace those stories. Private companies that understood the grain markets in various countries, particularly in the United States. So they could have had more influence on some of this decision-making than we recognize. But the wheat executive worked very closely, and it was really a couple private companies that were greasing the wheels of the actual purchasing. So the wheat executive placed the order, and then there's like 2-3 companies that would then execute the order. So they could have been influencing this and the purchasing. And again, I'm not sure about that. And this also ends up being tied to tonnage, where shipping kind of is just not set in, like, again, I didn't do that for this presentation, but you can't separate out the needs and shipping needs from this conversation as well. But yes, it's really fascinating.
Thank you so much. Well, I
Yeah.
selfishly got to ask you a
No,
series
I'm
of
great.
my
I'm actually glad we got to hang out.
But I think that the answers to your questions hopefully entertain more than just me. I expect that they did. And so I appreciate everyone coming today. I appreciate our speaker, Rosella Capella-Zielinski, zooming in from halfway across the country on her leave, since she's not at BU again. I forgot to mention that at the beginning, which is why we're zooming with her. But also I appreciate that we can do this with you halfway across the country and hearing about your research. And I'm excited to see all the ways in which it's going to impact thinking.
Thank you. And again, thank you everyone for joining us.